Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 44. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can always access our podcast episodes at thefederalnewswire.com as well. My guest today is Joseph Cella, the Ambassador of the United States of America to Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Tonga, and Tuvalu. From October 17, 2019 and to January 20th, 2021. He's the founder and principal of Pontifex Group, a consulting firm whose practice areas include public policy, public relations, crisis management, and institutional launching and growth. He's co-founder of the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. Ambassador Cella was our guest on episode 31, where we focused on key takeaways from his time representing the United States in the Pacific. We're happy to have him back for this episode to take a deep dive into the work being done in the States to counter CCP malign influences. Joseph, welcome back to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thank you for the opportunity to be back, Steve. One of the more important topics any given day is the nature of the subnational incursions and influence operations underway here on our shores by the PRC and the CCP.
Well, we do want to talk specifically about the state from which you hail, Michigan. And those of us who remember the last conversation, well, number one, thank you for remembering the previous conversations. But number two, we talked a lot about things overseas, and you shared a bit about your upbringing and interest that kind of got you interested in the world. Now, does this concern that you had seen in Michigan kind of arise from just what you'd seen gradually, or coming back from your service overseas? Do you think you had kind of an added sensitivity to what this challenge might be?
Great point, and it is the latter. So, while serving in the Indo-Pacific, front row seat to PRC, CCP, malign influences, influence operations, subnational incursions, and they're on the hunt 16 time zones away, as they are here in the Eastern time zone and the other 2 time zones in on our fair shores of the United States. So certainly had a heightened sensitivity of it, and there were certain flashpoints that ultimately gave rise to the engagement and countering the encounters that we've seen.
So let's talk a little bit about how you got kind of called into taking up this issue in the States. We've talked in other episodes about some of the malign influences in the States, things that had to do with agriculture, land, or universities. But the story in Michigan, I think, is a little bit different, if I'm not mistaken. But talk a little bit about what were the early warning signs and how this came to be a priority call for you.
2 things converged at the beginning of last year. First, in North Dakota, there was an effort by the 3rd largest food additive processor in China by the name of Fufang to make some inroads there. Bipartisan support to do this into the city of Grand Forks. They purchased 300 acres to build a wet corn milling plant. The problem with that, Steve, is that it was 12 miles from the door of Grand Forks Air Force Base. As you know, a classified, very sensitive Air Force base doing mission critical work, and that soon enough will be getting more important as the years go on. It involved the engagement of Senators Rubio and then the home state senators of Kramer and Hoeven to appeal for a CFIUS review with the Department of Treasury. They found no jurisdiction. And then it was really an all-out fight, citizen-led initiative to inform and educate as to the nature of the threat and why it wasn't good and how these things work. PRC nationals can come in and do not good things. Fortunately, Senators Kramer and Hoeven stayed on it, met with the Air Force, and the Air Force killed the project, saying it would be a grave risk, a grave threat to our national security. The second flashpoint was that Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia turned back a joint Ford cattle deal, cattle being the acronym for Contemporary Amperex Technology Limited, lithium-ion battery manufacturer based in the PRC, deeply tied to the CCP. And he blocked it. Again, bipartisan support to get it in there for a joint venture. And he called it a Trojan horse, rightly so. He knew well enough the nature of the beast, that is a subnational incursion and influence operation, spotted it, also saw the threat to not only our national security, but our economic security. So the third element that really gave rise to formally organizing something in Michigan was an article that appeared in the Detroit News that revealed that Governor Gretchen Whitmer and the Michigan Economic Development Corporation for years had been operating under 5 and 10-year binding non-disclosure agreements and kind of silly secret code names for economic development projects that involved cattle, as well as Goshen, another PRC-based and CCP-tied lithium-ion battery manufacturer. So the Detroit News reporter Beth LeBlanc blew that wide open, and nobody had really heard of it, Steve, until then. I called my former ambassadorial colleague, Peter Hoekstra, former member of Congress, former House Intel chair, and nobody real better to have by my side to do this. He was busy. I gave him a nudge, and he graciously accepted the engagement to join me on the front lines in mobilizing people, educating them, and informing them. And launched, born was the Michigan-China Economic Security Review Group. And we did set out about 18 months ago to educate and inform Michigan citizens, stakeholders, policy leaders about what subnational incursions are, what influence operations are, and how they're manifested in these deals that were never given the strict scrutiny as directed by our national security and intelligence agencies.
Well, the name sounds conspicuously similar to a congressionally mandated commission. I'm wondering whether that might have served as a model for the mission of what you were doing.
I would say impersonation is the sincerest form of flattery. So it speaks to the nature of their good work, and it speaks to the nature of us, and it really is who we are and what we're doing. Since early 2023 and continue to this day, and we'll be scaling soon enough on this beyond Michigan as well.
Yeah, well, before we talk about a few of the specifics with the case that is kind of driving this conversation in Michigan for the recent several months, if not longer, talk a little bit about how you are doing what you're doing. When Congress sets up a commission, they put them up in some fancy pants digs. I'm guessing maybe they didn't gift you this when you were starting your initiative, and then they'll have hearings, which I'm also guessing maybe you're not doing the formal hearings, but town hall-like gatherings, or share a little bit about how you're operationalizing the mission, doing it the Michigan way as opposed to the Capitol Hill way.
That's an excellent question, and I'm happy to say there's a dirt road about 100 feet outside of my window here in rural southeast Michigan. Live on a farm with my wife, Kristen, and our 7 kids, and between my home and Ambassador Hoekstra's home on the west side of the state, this is how we have done this work. We are volunteers. We've engaged with everyday citizens who have had these 2 massive projects come into very small towns, patriotic Americans of all partisan stripes engaged. They see this threat, they ask questions, and some might not know what a subnational incursion or influence operation is, but they know that this will change their backyard where they've known for generations, and they just don't like it. When they learn more about the nature of the deal, the billions of dollars in taxpayer dollars that have gone into it, they particularly don't like it. So it has involved any number of engagements with the media by Ambassador Hoekstra and I, opinion articles on the state level and the national level, TV interviews, radio interviews, appearing at a Senate hearing or a House hearing in Michigan when Michigan was advancing the funding for these deals, as also showing up at township meetings, conferring and strategizing with the grassroots people that live in these communities that have the hardest job of all. But it's been a blessing and an honor to engage with them and confer and help counter these encounters with these PRC-based CCP-tied entities.
Yeah, in these conversations, I assume that there's an element of who they are and an element of what they're doing that kind of sounds the alarm. And there's a little bit of both, I would guess. But and in these conversations, do you get a feel for which side of this kind of raises the concerns more among the everyday citizens and their representatives? Is it the CCP and who they are, or is it more what they're doing, getting into the tech industries or getting into areas where the taxpayer is subsidizing an effort that might undermine their own jobs?
It's really a broad base, a great question, but a broad-based coalition of people. Again, Republicans, Democrats, some who place a greater concern on environmental matters, to people who want our government to be better stewards of their taxpayer dollars, to those who are more tracking the China threat that is on our shores, and some are an amalgam of all of them. So it really depends where you're at. With each of these proposed deals, they're both in very close proximity to military installations, which on its own is a red flag. But it's really a beautiful exemplar of how our founders would have it when the consent of the governed has been ruptured in these instances. The governed react, and they've reacted, whether it's mobilization and having their grievances redressed through the court system, or through the election system, our system of elections, through recalls, and that has happened as well. And it's really our republic on grand display in terms of countering what has come down from government and business elites.
When it comes to action, that's a really good reminder of part of this. I mean, a lot of times there'll be concerns raised, research done about what's happening out there. Could be, like you said, the op-eds or conversations that raise awareness. And people tend to think of action being taken in legislatures or the executive branch. But in Michigan, you had citizens actually engage in an electoral recall.
Yep.
So talk a little bit, I guess, now about who was doing what with whom and where as this built up, and that will help explain where this recall happened and why that movement targeted decision makers at that location and level.
Sure. So in Michigan, in the Lower Peninsula, these two plants are proposed for two areas. One in southwestern Lower Michigan in the city of Marshall, and then the other in the northern mid portion of the Lower Peninsula in Big Rapids, Mecosta County, and some outlying townships there. So I will say that with respect to Green Township, Michigan, and Big Rapids Township, Michigan, where the proposed deal for Goshen was initially slated, there was a recall of the township supervisor in Big Rapids. He was operating under a non-disclosure agreement, and he would not discuss anything with fellow township board members who were asking him questions about the deal. What is this? Where are we going? Why are we doing it? And he would not divulge anything because he was covered under the NDA. So again, that is highly irregular, not normative. If you can't be accountable to a colleague who's been also elected, and he was saying the same things to his constituents, then it's time for the people to act. So
we'll talk about the irregularity a little bit too, because the CCP aligned and joint venture kind of entities, they're not the first foreign entities or even malign entities to try to come in and do business in the United States. point we've tried to make clear in the podcast is notions of reciprocity and sort of fundamental fairness, and rules should apply equally to all. If some entity, say from Ukraine, wanted to come in and do a project in rural Michigan or wherever else, they end up having these non-disclosures that basically lock up people's lips to talk about who's doing what with taxpayer funds?
We're plowing new earth here when it comes to China, and I would say that what you see with these instances where China is involved, it involves a lack of transparency. I mean, top authoritarian efficiency, I would say, where by their nature, they operate top down, high hand, heavy hand, and just get things done. I mean, in fact, Secretary Antony Blinken in a Face the Nation interview, I want to say it was last February of 23, he had said that there was really no distinction between business and the state, and we know the nature of the state of the CCP. So you see vestiges of that again, moving fast, moving in secret, and that is not how our republic is meant to operate, beyond the accountability of elected officials. So I would say this is new earth. I think that this is why our intelligence agencies and national security agencies convened in February of 22 a group of bipartisan elected officials from the state and local level and business owners to say, look, China's on the hunt. You have to be aware. They are going to use seemingly ostensibly benign business deals, but when in fact they're not. So therefore, you really need to subject them to strict scrutiny, due diligence to ensure accountability, transparency, and integrity. And Steve, none of that happened in Michigan. And again, you see the beauty of our republic, where there was almost a Newtonian reaction, an equal and opposite reaction, where people mobilized to get candidates filed to challenge those that were intertwined in advocating these deals, and then they were held to account. In addition to Big Rapids Township, Green Rapids Township had 5 of their 7 board members recalled, from the supervisor to 4 others on the township board because of the same. Covered under the NDAs, selling their property or attempting to sell their property to Goshen at hundreds of percent above market value. Some say close to 1,000%. Market skewing dynamic, again, textbook example, facet of an influence operation, and they were held to account as well. I will say that in a neighboring township where similar downstate, unrelated to the Goshen project or the cattle project, unrelated, another massive project had been forced. There was some discussion that was with a Chinese company, and initially they pulled out. And again, that supervisor was recalled. There's stuff on the record, Steve, with that one, back to the irregularity, where this supervisor and people she was commiserating with in local economic development, the local economic development entity, that use your personal email, use your personal cell phone. Again, making it beyond the accountability of the Freedom of Information Act request and Open Meetings Act and so forth. So those are very tangible elements of the broader dynamic of what's been going on with these PRC-based and CCP-tied companies.
I have to say, it's kind of shocking to hear that communications guidance that is somewhat similar to what we would give to U.S. visitors going to the PRC, so that your personal or business or government information isn't unknowingly disclosed
Correct.
to counterparts that want to do you harm. And here you have a guidance being given to Americans on American soil to follow the same guidance, to keep the information from Americans, not from the CCP. They're talking to them, which is just, that of itself is mind-blowing and should just be a massive what are we doing kind of moment. But apparently that's exactly how citizens at the local level felt. So how What was the process like on the recall? So you have in every state is a little bit different on elections. People forget we are 50 separate and sovereign states,
Right.
and every legislature writes their own laws and processes. It's not just presidential elections that might be a little different here or there, but on the recall. What was the process? Did someone have to file some paperwork, go through a court? How does that begin? And then candidates file, and then apparently there would
Correct.
be a particular period of time. Walk us through a little bit of the super fun nuts and bolts of
Yeah,
how
yeah,
this actually happens.
yeah. It's I think Bismarck had the famous quote of "Laws are like sausages. You never want to see either being made." But it can be very difficult. But I tell you that it was very inspiring to see patriotic people of all partisan stripes, of all ideological vantage points, mobilizing to counter this. And candidates were identified. That's the first step. Do you want to do this? Running for office is not, it can be a life altering thing. Your family is your constituency before that, and your family gets a lot larger after that. Then a number of petitions are circulated under Michigan law within the township, reaching a particular threshold. I think it's maybe 25% of the last gubernatorial election. And then you submit those. They have to be abided by certain protocols. The same circulator has to circulate it and sign it and date in the particular regimen and protocols. They submit that by a particular date. They're reviewed, and then if they're cleared, then the election is scheduled to have the vote. This is the vote that happened in November of last year. Candidates then filed, the alternative candidates to those that they're recalling, stand for election, and they were routed rather handily. Again, you really appreciated the depth and the breadth of the visceral reaction to the citizen rejection of the decision making, how they've operated without a lack of transparency or building in any integrity or accountability to this whole process. And the people spoke, and it's. I had mentioned earlier how the consent of the governed was ruptured, but this is really a restoration of that consent for the governed, by the governed, in a very remarkable, beautiful way. And I think it should and can serve as an example for other communities around the United States and different states that may be facing similar instances where the playbook exists, so to speak. And we've been conferring and consulting with other states and helping them similarly, and will continue to do so.
Well, the model of the citizens speak and the candidates and office holders are swapped out, that sounds inspirational. But talk a little bit about maybe of the Lucy and the football element of it, of people swapped out, project's over, right? Problem solved.
Complex. There were decisions made. Contracts signed. But so you have the old board, now ex-board, replaced. They succeeded and had the levers of their governance now in their hands. So with that, it was in Green Township. It was very difficult. They were the outgoing board were putting up all sorts of obstacles, kind of playing hide the football with them, whether it's emails and recording and accessing things that were being said and done by camera. I mean, again, it's almost as if very PRC CCP like. Tracking their movements in that regard, and filing FOIAs and just throwing sand in the gearbox, but then the township began to walk back. They rescinded certain things that the previous township had submitted to, whether it was 30 years ago, engaging a water deal with the city of Big Rapids. So they ended that. They ended their formal expression of support for the deal. They also terminated by terminating the water and sewer agreement. Goshen came in and sued in federal court, which is now ongoing. We'll see what happens with that. But that is the unfortunate way that Green Township is having their citizens are having the way that having their grievances redressed. It's certainly complicated. They're going to keep fighting and are not going to back down. I think they do have the high ground, certainly in the truth. We'll just have to see. Fortunately, they do have a means to appeal to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals if it comes to that. They're seeking a redress from the current judge now, and then we'll take the other steps necessary from there. But it really is telling that you have this $40 billion company, PRC-based, CCP-tied company, coming in, extracting nearly $1 billion from Michigan taxpayers when they really don't need it to do what they want to do. It's a national security threat. The whole thing was irregular. Again, as I'd mentioned, the state of Michigan did not abide by the directives as given by our intel and national security agencies to vet these things. There was zero vetting, and this is all downstream for that from that lack of vetting that never happened, Steve.
Yeah. Well, it's always just miraculously coincidental where they choose to do these things,
right.
too.
Yeah, sure.
But that's the fun part. Well, so we have this model. Number one, we'll continue to watch the story of how this plays out in Michigan. I think it's really important to see the process all the way through. I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens at the federal level, whether it reinforces the will of local citizens and how they've expressed their will and what happens in the legal process. Sure would be one of the terrible ironies for a hostile foreign entity like the CCP to be able to use our laws against the expressed consent of our citizens. So fingers crossed that the American system wins this one. But let's talk a little bit about the Michigan model on this and where and how it might be getting shared. I mean, even just the structure and idea of setting up the Michigan-China Security and Economic Review Group, modeled after the Congressional Commission, which has done some interesting work to help reinforce the regular legislative process. Have you had takers that are counterparts in other states, fellow travelers that, hey, we see what you're doing in Michigan, and maybe we can and should do things in our state like this? I mean, there's a few groups that are out working the grassroots,
Yes.
specifically at the state level on the CCP threat. And so I know it's been noticed, but can you talk a little bit about the conversations that are underway and where it might be spreading?
Sure. Yep. Well, I can tell you that the most immediate connectivity happened with the state of Illinois, where Goshen is putting up another plant, and it's part of the whole supply chain. So apparently the supply chain runs from Morocco to Michigan to Illinois, and somehow they'll get the supplies and illicitly and make money on that. But it's kind of a strange approach. In any event, it's rural Illinois, Manteno, Illinois, patriotic, a tribute to all of the World War II veterans and other veterans lining the streets. There, we went down, Ambassador Hoekstra and I went down to a rally, about 500 people in this town square last summer. Beautiful. And again, you really were able to get that fingertip sense of the nature of the outrage of what happened. Again, textbook in Illinois with what happened here in Michigan. And they're mobilizing. They're in court. They have a citizens organization. And we first linked up. I was going to a Notre Dame football game last fall, and I called one of the organizers and I said, you are now where we were 8 months ago, and spent a couple hours on the phone each way with him, and expanded the conversation and linked up with others, and it really went from there. And subsequently, we went down for the rally. So they are fully engaged, and again, whether it's in citizen grassroots initiatives, targeting officials for recalls soon enough, and also in the courts, but also that constant information and education to citizens who might not necessarily know the nature of the threat. I will say that we had contact with citizens in North Dakota, commiserating on things post facto, their success there. We've been in contact with citizens in Maine that are facing irregular, illegal marijuana growing operations that seem to be entangled with the underworld of Triad, which is PRC-based, CCP-tied entity. And then a group in North Carolina that's also mobilized to counter a threat. A lot of things are shrouded on that proposed deal through NDAs, and they're trying to extract some information. So the engagements continue to happen. There's another entity in Ohio that we're soon to be linking up with that's facing a similar dynamic. So there is another instance in Missouri that we've been engaged in. But again, the thread running through all of this is that the government and business officials have defied the direction of our national security and intelligence agencies. No strict scrutiny, no due diligence, no transparency, no integrity, accountability. And then it's about 2 years later that citizens find something out, or wake up, if you will, and find this thing in end stages for them to mobilize. And they have. And we fired a flare. There are people firing flares. You see Congress, individual congressmen engage, such as Darren LaHood in Illinois, to counter that Goshen project, and Congressman Jason Smith in Missouri, and others countering the PRC-based and CCP-tied push there. So, and certainly appreciate the great work of AFPI and others that are intrepidly fighting the fight. So there is no shortage of opportunities. We're soon to engage with another group out in California, where some mysterious buyers of farmland and land surrounding Travis Air Force Base is underway, and some very suspicious things are happening there that we'll be engaging in soon enough.
Well, it's great to see sort of the ripples in the pond start to bump into each other, where there's things happening in different places, and people with on-the-ground experience dealing with it are kind of comparing what's worked and how with each other, and then being able to localize and tailor their activities to what works in those localities and states, because it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of challenge, but best practices are best shared. So that, I think that is just a huge positive takeaway to what you guys have started there. And my goodness, the people of Michigan were lucky to have two former ambassadors with the backgrounds you guys have, with Pete Hoekstra with his House intelligence experience, and then your frontline experience overseas, to be able to lead on this. Not every state has that kind of a bench willing to step in, and hopefully that too can get replicated across the fruited plain. As wherever there's a sensitive site, there's probably an ag land purchase or a battery factory
100%.
or something else
100%.
that's percolating along.
Yep.
And so I just love the initiative, and I hope very much that our humble conversation starts to rattle around a little bit more. And I just wish you all the best in the work ahead. Now, the time we have remaining, aside from sort of these tech and battery related kind of projects, do you see, we're talking in the middle of 2024, as the balance of the year unfolds or what have you, in Michigan specifically, do you see other topic areas where your group is likely to focus and bear down on, or is the cup is basically full with what's going on and follow up on this, and you're seeing this through and helping others in other states learn from the model?
Yeah, and I think it's we'll keep on keeping on, fighting a good fight, running the race. Important is that I think to note is that, and this is not a partisan thing, national security, providing for our common defense, must always be bipartisan. It's a nonpartisan matter. You see it manifest beautifully in the establishment by former Speaker Kevin McCarthy of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, initially led by Chairman Mike Gallagher and Ranking Member Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy from Chicagoland, and then now chaired by my fellow Michigander, Congressman John Molinar, and still with the Ranking Member Congressman Krishnamurthy. And they have borne great fruit. I mean, that is, I think, exemplar, probably difficult work, but important bipartisan work that should be followed by others. In Michigan, there are state legislators that put forth, you get a sense of this tension, and I think in times things will come where you had them put together a 9-bill package of legislation that countered foreign influence in any number of ways. Again, not just directed at China, but Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela. And they formed also a Michigan Legislature National Security Working Group. Bipartisan outreach on both, thus far not successful. In recent weeks, Steve, they had amendments put forth in the House and Senate that would require the state of Michigan and the Michigan Economic Development Corporation to vet through the Department of Treasury these entities in a mandatory fashion before they're even considered. The legislature would be notified first. They would put it to the test of CFIUS and proceed from there, whether it's a foreign entity of concern, et cetera. In the House, in the committee, there was one lone Democrat that stepped up and voted for it. In committee, got to the floor, and it failed in committee, incidentally, but she bravely stood up. The floor, it didn't have enough voices recognized, and it failed. A great deal of pressure was brought on her as a result. In the Senate, a similar amendment was put forth, 20-18. It was defeated by the Democrat majority. Again, the polling data that shows this is a bipartisan and nonpartisan concern really should, and soon enough, I hope, through education and perseverance and persistence, will reflect in more cooperation across the aisle, no matter the ideology or party. The polling data shows, I think that there was one that came out in the not too distant past here in Michigan that showed 72% of all Michiganders are opposed to the notion of providing taxpayer funding to a PRC-based and CCP-tied entity. So this is a 70% issue, an 80% issue that I think is important to throw out into the arena of the electoral process this year on the local, state, and federal level, because it's no greater. I mean, really, the constitutional charge we have is among the first charges is to provide for our common defense. And I say that let there be a very robust debate on this, and the chips fall where they may between candidates and the positions that they take on this very important issue.
Well, I can't think of a better note on which to conclude our conversation on that very high and absolutely truthful and important point. But for our audience, Joseph, where would you direct them to keep up with the very important work we've been talking about with the Michigan-China Economic and Security Review Group?
Thanks for that. We are a very lean to the bone operation. We are volunteers. We have a Twitter page that is at MCESRG, and that has everything that we do put forth as late as yesterday. So stay tuned to that, and we'll be scaling our work nationally here soon enough. So I hope to be honored by a third chance to sit with you and talk further in the coming months.
Well, that would be outstanding. And of course, the most important commonality that you and Chairman Molinar have is not Michigan. It's the fact that both of you have been guests on the China Desk podcast. That, of course, counts above all else. And I'm sure you can, we'll get you like a lapel pin to wear with pride at some point. But I guess we have to get some non-made in China lapel pins.
Right. Yep. Time for swag. Time for some swag.
Well, I greatly enjoyed talking with you today, Joseph. And to our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing and take a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Ambassador Joseph Cella, for sharing your perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.